I've been looking forward to this for ages, and mainly because I want to say, my name's Matt Hancock. I'm proud to be the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, a member of the Cabinet in the UK, and made by Dyslexia. And I haven't talked about this for almost the entirety of my adult life. But I'm incredibly proud to be here at the Global Dyslexia Summit, saying to dyslexic people all over the world, you can do it. And for years, dyslexia was seen as just a problem. And sure, as all of us in this room know, it brings its challenges. For me, I find long words hard to spell. I find dense writing hard to read. I get frustrated when people use long words when short words will do. And that does apply to some of my cabinet and former cabinet colleagues. But for me and for us and for the world, let us say it loud and clear that dyslexia brings challenges. Your brain works in a different way, but with the right support, dyslexia brings big benefits too. Dyslexia isn't a disability, but a difference, and it's a distinction, not a drawback. It's like we're on Android and the rest of the world is on Microsoft Windows. And now, sometimes when you're on different operating systems, there are going to be interface issues, right? Some misunderstandings. Like when I was a boy driving home with my parents, I saw a sign saying "Swan Wood for sale." And in my mind, there was a whole wood of swans for sale. You can imagine it. Just picture it. We dyslexics are quite good at picturing things. An entire wood full of swans for sale. After making my parents do a detour to arrive back at this sign to find out what was going on, they looked at the sign and then looked at me and said, "Matt, it says sawn wood for sale. It's sawn wood." It was quite a long drive home. And there was some mickey taking at my expense, but at least we had a boot full of wood to see us through the winter. So, like I said, there have been some misunderstandings. I wasn't sure whether to tell his story, but I will, because I'm still friends with the guy it involves. When I was, I was helping out in the 2001 general election. I was helping my friend Nick St. Aubin, who is the MP for Guildford. And he asked me to, he wrote his election address that was going to every household in the constituency here, and he asked me to typeset it. And at this point, Microsoft had put their spell checker into Word, but not into PowerPoint. So I mocked it up in PowerPoint, and I thought there was this really lovely phrase. He said, "I want to unite the community." And so I thought, that's a nice phrase. I drew it out and put it as a subheading, quite big, bold type on the front page. Some of you sounds like you might have heard this story before. And I typeset it. I sent it to the printers. I picked it up from the printers in all these boxes. I took it to the post office and gave it to the Royal Mail. They posted it to all 50,000 households in Guildford. And then he looked at it and he said, "Matt, why does it say I want to untie the community?" He lost by just over 500 votes. It was the first time Guildford had been lost by the Conservatives in 100 years. And he remains a friend. I haven't brought myself to tell him I'm a dyslexic. So, Nick, I'm a dyslexic, and I'm really sorry about the job. So there are some big benefits, though, to being dyslexic. And there's three things I just want to touch on today that I think are very important for the future of dyslexics across the world. Firstly, ending the stigma. Secondly, early assessment. And third, how the world needs more people to think like we dyslexics do. Firstly, on stigma. As I said, I recently went public, and I have been overwhelmed by the sheer outpouring of support. Texts, emails, messages from fellow dyslexics, other people with their own similar stories to tell, lots of parents, especially parents of youngsters who are struggling with dyslexia. Other MPs I had no idea were dyslexic. One other member of the cabinet, Brandon Lewis, also dyslexic. It turns out dyslexic ministers are like buses. You wait for ages for one to turn up, and then you get two along at once. It really shouldn't be, though, a surprise. because dyslexia affects 1 in 10 people. And when the skills the world increasingly needs of creativity and lateral thinking and empathy, these skills are more prevalent in dyslexics because we find written communication that much harder. Just put that into context. The same percentage of the population are dyslexic as are left-handed. Not the majority, sure, but certainly part of the mainstream. So why did it take so long for me to come out as a dyslexic? If I'm honest, it's in part because there was still a fear. A fear that old stereotypes about dyslexics would get dredged up, that we're lazy, that we're stupid, that we can't do things that come easily to other people. Now, these stereotypes have been proven to be lazy and stupid in themselves. Because there's nothing a dyslexic can't do, and in fact, there's many things that we do better. A dyslexic painted the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in modern art, Western art. It says here Western art, I read it as modern art. There you go. Still getting me into trouble. A dyslexic invented the electric light bulb, ushering in a new age for mankind. A dyslexic discovered the theory of relativity and set a new definition for the word genius. Yet, Made by Dyslexia's research found that 9 out of 10 dyslexics said that they'd been made to feel angry, stupid, or embarrassed because they had dyslexia, and that is true for me too. And only 3% of the wider public believe dyslexia is a positive trait. This is unbelievable. Somehow, in 2018, there is still a stigma and a prejudice that dyslexics are less rather than more, or at the very least, not equal to other people. Now, of course, there are some things that do come with greater difficulty, like spelling. I used to dread spelling tests at school. And if it wasn't for the invention of the spell checker, there's a good chance, I believe, that I wouldn't be standing here before you today as the health secretary. It's one of the reasons I'm such a firm believer in the potential of technology for everybody to fulfill their potential. So thank you, Bill Gates, for your incredible invention. Thank you, Steve Jobs, for the one I use every day now. I even use spell check to write this speech. I even find the word dyslexic quite hard. Why on earth couldn't they come up with an easier word? It's something His Royal Highness and I were agreeing on earlier. I think now as health secretary, I might be able to do something about that. How's about it? But I think that the real reason dyslexia is still seen by some as a drawback is because they look at life through a 20th century or even a 19th century lens, not a 21st century lens, where they prioritize straight-line thinking, not creativity or insight. Now, I can understand the importance of spelling and how we need a standardized system so we can read and write without misunderstanding each other. I do not reject that requirement. I just struggle in person to see what order the letters should go on the page sometimes. And I reject those who say that spelling isn't important, because even though I find it hard, it doesn't mean I don't value it. For me, relearning spelling through phonics in my early 20s got me to a position where I can just about manage on paper. And then, like all dyslexics, I got my workarounds. I require short briefings, and I have a brilliant civil service team who ensure that they pull out the vital statistics, the important statistics, and get them on paper. I have really scratchy handwriting, which I'm sure I developed to make it harder to spot a spelling mistake. And don't you do that? If I've got to write a handwritten letter and I'm not sure of a spelling and I haven't got time to look it up, I just put a sort of line across and a couple of dots above it. And people can generally work it out. Wouldn't it be much easier, though, if instead of having to have so many of these workarounds, we could change mindsets in school and in colleges, in office and in workplaces. If a young child coming into school isn't made to feel inferior to his or her classmates simply because their brain is wired differently, because that's where the stigma starts. And the worst kind of stigma is the one that is then internalized, when you actually believe you're not capable, that you can't rather than can do something. Schools that are using phonics are starting to address this. Since the government introduced phonics screening checks in 2012, we've seen the number of 6-year-olds reaching the expected reading phonics standard to go from 58% to 82% this year. And I want to pay tribute, thanks, Mum, I want to pay tribute to to the Department for Education for all the work that they've done. And they fund specialist resources for teacher training and new advanced online modules on dyslexia so we can enhance teachers' knowledge and understanding and skills. This is all welcome, and it's what the government's reforms in this area were designed to do. And I believe that education and health and public health and social care commissioners should work more closely together to deliver better for children and young people with different education needs, because I want to see every child taught according to their need. And this brings me to the second thing I want to briefly touch on, early assessment. Now, I discovered that I was dyslexic pretty late on. I was already at university. I'd made it through school by specializing in maths subjects. And then when a brilliant tutor saw that my ability to talk was rather different to my ability to write, he suggested I went and got myself tested. And that, for me, was my breakthrough moment. I retaught myself grammar and spelling from scratch on computer courses, and I was caught early enough. Diagnosis made adaptation so much easier, but there are still too many stories of late assessment, which makes it that much harder. Early assessment and identification of dyslexia is essential to keeping a child's life chances and horizons open. And with the right support and technology, anything is possible if you're dyslexic. I think every child who needs a dyslexia assessment should get a dyslexia assessment to ensure children with different educational needs get the support they need. It's only by early assessment we can ensure dyslexics fulfill their potential, and that as a society we start to see dyslexia not as a weakness but as a strength, a huge strength to draw on, to meet the challenge of the changing nature of work and the technological revolution that's coming round the corner. And this is my third and final point today. Why the world needs more people who think like dyslexics. Over a generation, automation has moved the world of work from valuing brawn to valuing brains, and over the next generation, as the march of the machines takes over straight-line cognitive functions, what will set human beings apart from the machines is our creativity, our intuition, our emotional and social intelligence, our ability to think laterally and imaginatively, our visualization, our reasoning, and how we can bring a fresh perspective to an old and sometimes seemingly intractable problem. That's what will set us humans apart from the robots. And these are exactly the skills and the strengths that dyslexics have in abundance. We know that better decisions are made when people bring different perspectives. That, incidentally, is what underpins my profound belief in diversity. Throughout my career, I've sought to promote diversity of race, of background, of gender, of sexual orientation. Not just because, as a liberal conservative, I believe profoundly in the equality of opportunity for each and every one of us to reach our potential. And I believe in the role of society and in the role of the state to see that justice made real. But more than that, I admire what Idris Elba calls the diversity of thought. Dyslexia, I couldn't even read the bloody word. Dyslexia is another dimension of diversity of thought. Dyslexia is another dimension of diversity of thought. And maybe because I'm dyslexic, that's why I feel so strongly about it. So rather than trying to get dyslexics to think like everyone else, we should value the diversity of thought that dyslexics bring. Imagination, creativity, neurodiverse dyslexic abilities are the skills of the future. And these strengths can help build a better society, better businesses, spark innovation, create new solutions. We may, in fact, hold the answer to some of the biggest challenges in education, in employment, and in wider society. So we shouldn't fear dyslexia or see it as a weakness. We should embrace it and see it as a strength. And if anybody ever tells you dyslexia is just a disability or a drawback, say no. It's a mark of distinction, a mark of difference, which has driven some of humanity's greatest ever achievements and let us each say, loud and clear, I'm proud to be a dyslexic.
Matt has got time for a couple of questions. Questions from the audience?
Working more closely with education. How do you see health moving forward with the education, health and care plans that are supposed to support children, young people and their families in accessing the support that they need?
Well, I think it's a good question, which is the practical consequences of this direction of travel is that we put more support into those areas. We're currently writing the long-term plan for the future of the health system, and making sure that we get more support in those sorts of areas is a critical part of it. It's not an easy solution because also local government is heavily involved, especially where the needs are highest. So it's something that requires coordination. But it's something that we're working with the education department on, and believe you me, I'll be pushing for it inside government.
Up this side.
Hi. I just want a couple of questions, really. Firstly, I guess looking back now, do you think that your dyslexia was a help or a hindrance to your career? And also, really interested in your progressive views, but whether you think Whitehall generally is ready to be as progressive as you to embrace a diverse workforce?
Well, I think, was it a help or a hindrance? It's impossible to know the counterfactual. It definitely would have been a hindrance if I think, if I hadn't been diagnosed and then gone out of my way, then I knew what the problem was, and I could go back to base zero and reteach myself how to spell, which was enough to get me through handwritten exams before spell checker came along and solved that particular part of the problem for me. Has it been a help? Well, there's no doubt that I think differently, especially about the reams of paper. Mervyn and I were talking about this before. In Whitehall, there are reams of paper that come into a minister's box, and I have to ruthlessly prioritize. Priority is what's important. What is the question you're asking me here? What is the evidence I need to understand? And what is the decision I need to take? These are the questions that I ask my civil servants. And it's always, almost always, it's a skill mix that's what you need, right? And the civil service is brilliant at the straight line thinking and at assessing all of the evidence and at the full rigor. And the job of the politician is actually is direction and leadership and understanding the big picture and how it connects with other parts and understanding the human side, not least the democratic element. And I think that being able to step back and being required to step back helps. In fact, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, I had a text from Michael Heseltine after I first said that I was dyslexic, saying he was sure that for him it helped him get cut through the thickets, as he put it. Now, there is a funny side to that story, which is I then tried to save his number in my phone, and I couldn't spell his bloody surname. I mean, I knew there was an E and an L and an S in the middle there. I got to get the T, I-N-E at the end, but there you go. In practice.
I'll take a couple of more questions at the back there, but when you look back on schooling, and the next panel is going to be about the workplace of today, but when you look back in your schooling, were you aware of the challenge you were having, or not really? Yeah,
I was in primary school. I was terrible at spelling tests, and then at secondary school, I essentially just dropped essay-based and English subjects, and I got through on my maths, and that was fine, but it wasn't what I wanted to do, and I was perfectly interested in maths and physics, but I went to Oxford to study PPE because I really wanted to get into to understand the humanities, which is where my interests really lie. And it was when I got there, as I said, that it got picked up. And after that, the solutions and the workarounds and the direct retraining of my brain could all happen.
More a comment than a question. I just wanted to point out that dyslexia is a spectrum disorder. So you may have someone that's twice exceptional with a high IQ and has difficulty spelling, but you might also have a 6-year-old that knows 7 letters, an 8 or 9-year-old that has decode CVC words every time they see them, has difficulty with expressive, receptive, pragmatic language and word retrieval issues. So I just wanted to point out that a lot of kids it's a spectrum, and a lot of kids can struggle early significantly.
Absolutely. So I know that, and it's interesting in thinking about how to talk about this, knowing that as a member of the cabinet, when I spoke about it, it was likely to be reported. I thought about that and I talked to some of the experts about it, and they said it's really important. People who are dyslexic, we're just dyslexic, right? Of course there's a spectrum within that. But as soon as people start differentiating between serious and less serious dyslexia, then you essentially are starting to devalue it, especially at the boundary. So we're just dyslexic, right? And we're proud of it, and we're not trying to hide it anymore.
I did a short stint in government, and the private secretary has a way of bringing a session to an end. I've had that signal.
Maybe 2 more questions.
2 more, okay. This is the great thing about having... So we'll take 2 questions over here.
So I'm a fellow dyslexic and proud, so thank you for sharing your story. So my question is, this feels very much like a social movement to me. And throughout the history of the world, social movements have been incredibly powerful if they've engaged young people in them. And I was wondering about your thoughts on the role of young people in this movement, and is it a social movement from your view?
Yeah, it's the start of a social movement. But boy, since I've come out, the amount of support I've had, and the people who I didn't know were also dyslexic. I mean, like a fellow cabinet minister, right? Absolutely brilliant. I really feel like there's a movement, and it has a real emotional connection to an awful lot of people, especially parents of children who are struggling with dyslexia, and people, of course, who are dyslexic themselves. And there are changes that we need to see. The first question was about some of them, and I mentioned some others in my remarks. And no doubt there's others that we haven't thought of yet. So absolutely, this is the beginning of a social movement. We saw it here first at the Global Dyslexia Summit.
Last question.
I support children who struggle at home, and I find that really helps them. They can talk to me about what it is that's affecting them at school. Invariably, they are dyslexic and they haven't been assessed. Is it something that could be considered at government, that children could be assessed around the age of 7, all children, and then the support is then immediately in place, rather than children get to 15, and in my experience of supporting parents, want to commit suicide, which I know is very strong, but that's my experience. And I think if we could assess them at 7, whether they are or not, and then support them, I think a lot of the stories that have been told this afternoon and in the past would be improved.
Well, I think that this is a really good note to end on. Of course, I want to see everybody who is dyslexic to get that assessment. And I take the point that you make about ensuring everybody gets that chance. But there's something broader than that, which is that I know that I'm very lucky. I was supported and I was diagnosed, and I could then do something about it, and I got to a position where I can fully function. And that isn't true for everybody. And we know that the proportion of those who are for instance, in prison, is much, much higher proportion of those people who can't read, and higher proportion of people who are dyslexic and didn't get the support that I got. And so although this is a cheerful and jolly event, and so it should be, we should remember the people who aren't here, who didn't get the support they needed, and who it's negatively affected their lives. By contrast, I have an amazing support network, and I've just spotted right at the back is the guy who told me to go public with it, and I want to say a big thank you to you. Who's a civil servant who I nervously disclosed my dyslexia to, saying you need to write shorter cover notes, and he said, well, I'm dyslexic too, and you should probably talk about this. So so I have this amazing support network that allows me to do my job, but it isn't available to everybody, and it hasn't been, and we must make sure that the people whose lives are don't turn out the way mine has get the support they need to. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Wait, I'll just say, I think, as you describe, a movement, but certainly we need role models, and I think you'd agree that Matt is a great role model and can be an enormous inspiration to many people. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.